Okay, so hello everybody. It's my great pleasure today to introduce Jay McClelland, who really needs no further introduction, but I will introduce him anyway. So Jay did his master's in psychology at Columbia, which he then followed with a PhD in cognitive psychology at Penn, and then spent many years at CMU as a professor of psychology and cognitive neuroscience before he moved to Stanford in 2006, where he continues to be in gainful employment. And he will speak today about capturing intelligence at the level of thought. Thanks a million, Jay, and over to you.
Thank you. All right. Hello, everyone. I see a few familiar faces or names of a few familiar people. And I look forward to your thoughts and reactions to my ideas here. So we could ask ourselves the question, what sort of a system do we need to model intelligence? And in the 80s, we argued in the PDP research group at UCSD, where we first hatched these ideas, that AI systems of the day would never work. We proposed a set of ideas called parallel distributed processing as an alternative. And at the time, they generated a lot of interest, but they had limitations, leading them to be abandoned around the turn of the century. I was actually feeling a little bit alone and isolated around in that period. But about 10 years later, all of that began to change. So what I want to do is tell you briefly about these principles that we were working on in the work we started in the late 70s and ended up in the PDP volumes around the middle of the 80s, and which I see as now being essentially the core principles underlying today's AI systems. In these systems, processing occurs via the propagation of graded activations signals among simple processing units. We thought of them as neurons or proxies for neuron-like computing elements. And in today's AI systems, they're elements of long vectors. But it's very, very much the same kind of thing. Representations in these systems are distributed patterns of activation across these units. And the knowledge in the system is in the connections, the matrices of weights that connect one population of units or one array of elements that you could think of as making a vector to another. And learning occurs through adjusting these connections to do a variety of things, to match a target output, to maximize a reward, or to maximize some other objective like reconstruction or similarity to other things or anything like that. But in any case, you're adjusting connections to perform some particular target task or to meet some particular target criterion. And in some ways, these AI systems that are based on these PDP principles are pretty smart. They function well enough to be in use every day for speech recognition, language translation, and many other things. They exceed human performance in games like chess and Go. They're getting more and more powerful every day, and LLMs and visual language models have become ubiquitous tools threatening to replace humans in many domains. Back in late 2022, Sam Altman said this: language models, they're going to be the next big deal. Talk to a computer and get what you want for increasingly complex definitions of want. He said then, this is an early demo of what's possible. Still a lot of limitations, very much a research release. But soon you'll be able to have helpful assistants that talk to you, answer questions, and give advice. Later you can have something that goes on and does tasks for you. Eventually you can have something that goes off and discovers new knowledge for you. So what was he talking about? He was talking about ChatGPT that was released on the same day that he wrote these statements. And that model was a very powerful model. it's based on a very much on the principles of parallel distributed processing, but in a configuration that's different from the way that they were configured just a few short years before that. And what I'm going to do in the next 3 to 5 minutes is just to put us all on the same page about some of the core features of these language models. They have incredible strengths, as we'll see, but they also have some weaknesses. And by going into these particular core features, I'll be able to bring out what I see as a foundation of some of these weaknesses, for the basis of some of these weaknesses. Okay, so a large language model includes an innovative mechanism, which I call query-based attention. And the way this mechanism works is it involves the idea that a query can be generated when a word comes into the language model to find useful information in the context of the model. So in this case, we're imagining that the word that's coming in now is the word bat. And in the context, we've already had John hit the ball with the. So what does this mechanism do? The query is used to probe representations of items in the previous context. And based on the quality of goodness of match of the query with these items in the previous context, we get a similarity score, which is then turned into a attention weight. And what we get back is the weighted sum of vectors from items in the context, providing us with information that we can use to constrain our interpretation of this current word. So for example, in this case, the current word is bat. We might not know whether it's a flying mammal or something used to hit a ball, but the context provides a lot of relevant information. And I imagine that, one of the things that this word does is it sends a query that asks the question, well, what was the action in the context? In this case, the action was hit. If it had been fly, it might have told me that this was a flying animal, but it's hit, and that's something you usually do with like a wooden bat that you swing at something. So we get a good match there, and we get a return vector that comes mostly back from hit. It also is coming a little bit back from with in this case, because with might be, oh yeah, you use a bat to do something, right? With the bat. So I'm an instrument, and that's different from a flying animal. In any case, we've queried the context, and therefore we've gotten back some information that we can use to constrain our interpretation of this word and to help us make predictions about words that might follow. So let's put this into the language model. The language model consists of a huge array of these little transformer modules. Each one of the 3 blocks you see here is a transformer module. And it has a query-based attention submodule and a feed-forward neural network submodule. Crucial one for us is the query-based attention module, where at each word, let's say bat here, we can query all the preceding words and get back this weighted attention vector, which we can use to constrain our interpretation of this input. We could further propagate this through a feed-forward network, and we could generate something at the output, which is a new vector, which in this case, I'm imagining at the lower levels of this model has been moved a little bit in the direction of being more like a baseball bat instead of being halfway in between a flying bat and a baseball bat. Putting this in an even larger context, we can imagine that this word bat is occurring within a longer sequence of words. We're making predictions of each subsequent word from each word as it comes along. And given all the context up to and including the word bat, when we get the word and in this sentence, John hit the ball with the bat. And we can imagine that John probably is going to run to first base, at least if we've been trained on American baseball. Maybe in cricket, he would be running to the other wicket. In any case, this is how these language models basically work. But one point that I want to make here is that they consist of a huge array of these modules. There can be as many as 100 or so of them deep. Whoops, excuse me, I didn't mean to advance the slide. And within each query-based attention module, there could be up to about 100 different queries that match 100 different sets of keys and return 100 different sets of weighted attention scores, so that we can use context in a multitude of different ways. And gradually through the stack through this very, very deep model, we can learn to make next word predictions based on prior context. One other thing about them is that the prior context can be up to 12,000 or so tokens long during the learning process, so that when the model is being trained, it's actually learning all of the connection weights that underlie the query's keys and values. There's learned connection weight matrices that underlie those things in service of doing a better job predicting the next token in the sequence. And that is essentially the way in which this whole thing is exactly an instantiation of those principles that I described before, of using patterns of activation and connection weights to map these patterns to other patterns, and teaching signals in service of doing a task, in this case, next token prediction, to improve their ability to function and perform. So that's the core of the language model. And they're pretty good at using context. This is something that Dave Rollhart was really passionate about, and what got me collaborating with him back in the late 1970s and led to the PDP volumes. He kind of argued that one of the things that AI was missing was the ability to exploit context appropriately. And let's see how a current instance of a chatbot, I think this one, we tested this a few weeks ago now in OpenAI's ChatGPT, does at exploiting context. So here's a prompt that we gave it. I use its bark to make paper. In the previous sentence, make your best guess about what it refers to. ChatGPT's response is, in this given sentence, the word it most likely refers to the bark of a tree. Compare this to a second conversation. I use its bark to keep the house safe. In the previous sentence, make your best guess about what the word it refers to. In the given sentence, the word it likely refers to a dog. The use of bark suggests a protective behavior associated with dogs, and they're commonly known for guarding homes by barking to alert their owners to potential threats. This is an amazingly good use of context, and even a good explanation of the rationale for using these words this way in context. So in some ways, language models are really quite amazing and competent. And they're being touted these days as being really good at reasoning and problem solving too. But how smart are they really? This is a question that I think many people are asking. We're asking it in our own ways, and I'm thinking about it myself a lot. And I'm going to be arguing that, well, they've got some limitations, but hey, so do we. So let's think about that a little bit, and we'll talk about those ideas here for a few minutes. So let's start with the LLM. This is a little older now. I think probably the models today might not be tripped up as easily as this, but this was only about a year ago that I did this. I asked ChatGPT, can you place one X in each row and column of a 4x4 grid without any of the x's being adjacent horizontally, vertically, or diagonally. And GPT-4 said, yes, it's possible to place one x in each row and column of a 4x4 grid without any of the x's being adjacent horizontally, vertically, or diagonally. Here is one possible solution. Does anybody see a problem with this? Well, the x's in the second and third row are adjacent to each other diagonally. And I had previously checked that the model understood what was meant by diagonal adjacency. So it's not like it didn't know what that meant. And then it says in this arrangement, none of the x's are adjacent in any direction, meeting the specified conditions. But I said, hey, your grid seems to have diagonally adjacent x's in the second and third rows. Do you agree? And of course, GPT has been fine-tuned with reinforcement learning to acknowledge its mistakes when they're pointed out to it. And it said, yes, you're correct. My previous example does have diagonally adjacent x's in the second and third rows. Unfortunately, it is not possible to place x's in a 4x4 grid without any of them being adjacent, horizontally, vertically, or diagonally. Well, GPT-4 was wrong again, and I've illustrated the solution here. None of these x's are adjacent horizontally, vertically, or diagonally. So models make mistakes. They hallucinate. This is something people talk about a lot. They say things about what they're doing that they aren't actually doing when they do them. That's another thing that they do. So they're far from perfect as embodiments of our ideals of intelligence. But how smart are we humans really anyway? Well, here's a famous example of something that many people are fooled by. This is a question for a game contestant. This is called the Monty Hall problem. In case you haven't heard of it, it goes like this. A Cadillac is hidden behind one of the three doors that you see in front of you here. Initially, all three doors are closed. A contestant initially selects door one as his guess as to which door might contain the Cadillac. And if that door gets opened, he gets the Cadillac, if it's there. If not, there's a goat and he doesn't get anything. So the game show host opens another door and reveals that there's a goat behind this third door, and he offers the contestant, who initially chose door one, a chance to change his guess. Should the contestant keep his guess the same or switch to door two? The correct answer is you will increase your chances of winning from 1/3 to 2/3 if you switch. Naive participants, however, choose to stay rather than switch in great preponderance of the cases. And according to Wikipedia, when the puzzle and its correct answer were published in a column in Parade magazine, approximately 10,000 readers, including nearly 1,000 with PhDs, wrote to the magazine, most of them calling this wrong. Even when given explanations, simulations, and formal proofs, many people still didn't accept that switching is the best strategy. And there's a story about the famous mathematician Paul Erdos, who himself was completely stumped by this problem. Said, no, it's impossible. It should make no difference. And he was wrong. So we're not perfect reasoners either. And we are subject to illusion. Here's one I think at Birkbeck College you may be familiar with. This is a simple logic game. The Wason selection task, famously invented in London and further assessed and developed by research at Birkbeck. And many other places, of course. So in our particular presentation of it, we are set it up this way. The cards to the right are from a logic game. Each card has a number on one side and a letter on the back. Which card or cards must be turned over to check if they obey this rule? If a card has an even number on one side, then it has an X on the other side. When most people do this task, they immediately turn over the card with the even number, the 6. And that's one of the cards that they should turn over. But they fail to turn over the crucial other card, which is the card that has a Z on it. If I got this right, let me check. Because if that card had an even number on the other side, then it would violate this rule. Instead, they typically turn over the card with the X on it to see if it's got a vowel on the other side. Or the card with the 3 on it, because then they would expect it not to have an X on the other side. In any case, they don't do the right thing. But if they're told, if they're given this in a common sense reasoning setting, each check to the right is for a purchase at a store. Each check has an amount of a purchase on one side and a box for the manager's approval on the other. Which check or checks must be turned over to check if they obey the rule? And the rule is, if a check is for more than $25, then the manager's approval must be checked on the back. And in this case, many, many more people will turn over the check that doesn't have the manager's approval on the back to make sure that it's not for more than $25, which is exactly analogous to the case of the Z in the more abstract example. So humans, when we reason, aren't, like strictly logical, right? And many, many theories have been offered to explain exactly what it is that makes it so that we tend to make the wrong answer in these abstract cases and why it is that we tend to make the right answers in these other cases. My point for right now is to point out that this is something that is exhibited by language models as well. This is work that I, as a co-author on, through my collaboration with DeepMind, with Andrew Lampin and others, and it was largely done while they were here in London at DeepMind. For a number of different models, and also for human subjects, they presented 3 kinds of examples. Arbitrary ones, like with vowels and consonants and letters and numbers, where the relationship is just completely arbitrary. Realistic ones, like the one with the checks, and nonsense ones that had sort of, meaningful content, but they didn't make sense. So the rules didn't make sense in terms of common sense knowledge about relationships that make sense in the world. Like, oh, if a check is for a lot of money, you've got to make sure it's a valid check. Okay, so what you see here is the results of many different systems, some of whom are humans and others of whom are language models. And they're all exhibiting pretty much the same pattern, except for this thing here. What's that? Well, it turns out that that's the humans who responded quickly. If you test humans online using Mechanical Turk or something like that, you often get complete garbage responses. So you have to actually make people think. You have to say, oh, this is a hard reasoning problem. We want you to go carefully and slowly. And even then, only some of them actually follow that instruction. So if you look at those subjects who do follow that instruction, they show an advantage for the realistic forms over the other kinds. And this is a very general trend across several different language models as well, including GPT models, some DeepMind models. They all show much worse performance with the arbitrary ones compared to the realistic ones, and there's some variation in how they do with the nonsense ones, but in general, realistic is much better than arbitrary. So LLMs are like people, or people are like LLMs. We aren't the perfect reasoners that we think, and I think that's one of the really interesting things about them. Myself, I think that they work as well as they do for processing natural language, because in a way, natural language is a reflection of our human-like reasoning abilities, and those human-like reasoning abilities are not strictly captured by adherence to principles of logic. So in that sense, they are human-like in some ways. So a really important question that we might want to ask if we're worried about AI is, how do we make our AIs be more like our ideal selves rather than our actual selves? And that's one of the things that I try to think about. But I also would like to share some ideas I've been thinking about how to capture some of the more natural aspects of our reasoning abilities that they are actually very broken at in comparison to us. So one thing is that they require up to 100,000 times more training data than a human can experience in a lifetime. And just to make this visually explicit, I have made this slide here in which I've shown to scale, okay, in terms of the area covered on my screen, the upper bound of the number of words or word-like tokens that a human being might be able to perceive in a lifetime. And if you look really carefully, you'll see a little tiny red dot in the corner of this rectangle. You'd need to multiply that rectangle 10,000 times, 100,000 times to fill this space. And that is the difference or the scope of the variation between humans and LLMs and how much data they're trained with. Instead of a mere few billion tokens, they're trained with tens of trillions of tokens. And that's a lot. Secondly, they fail to generalize in seemingly obvious ways. So this paper that appeared in very early in 2024 brings out this particular problem. It's sort of reflected just naturalistically in GPT-4's knowledge base. You can ask it questions like, who is Tom Cruise's mother? And it'll give you the answer. But if you ask it, who is Mary Lee Pfeiffer's son? That's Tom Cruise's mother. It says, as of September 21, there's no widely known information about a person named Mary Lee Pfeiffer having a notable son. How is this possible? This is a kind of a violation of common sense knowledge, right? It's not like we are maybe completely insusceptible to knowing things in a certain directionality or in terms of the particular phrasing in which they're presented, but it seems like a fairly critical failure of inference. And now in my lab, we've actually done experiments to verify that people, can do these reversals. And I'm not going to talk so much about the details of that because I haven't got that much time. There is a paper that we've submitted to the Coxside proceedings that's related to that. But I want to talk to you about my conception of what's wrong with the LLMs. And so I'm going to use the last part of my time for that purpose. So in this paper that I was just referring to, they assessed the models further by making a synthetic data set. They made up names and paired them with roles, and they taught the model these things in one order by fine-tuning them into the model's connection weights, and then they looked to see whether the model could answer the same question if posed in the opposite direction, and it was basically completely at chance. So the learning by the same method that's used to train these models in the first place does not result in generalizable knowledge. And to the extent that that knowledge is generalizable, it makes you think that the only reason they can generalize it is that they've actually seen it in many, many different orders so that it actually works in both directions. It's actually in their weights in both directions, if you like. So what seems to be happening is if you take the model and give it, so I've got a very minimal example of this here. If the sentence is John is Bill's and it's got to predict father now, when it's predicting father, it doesn't know the answer, when you're first teaching it this. So it's got an error at the output and it gets an error signal, and that error signal propagates back through it. And it makes it so the model wants to let John and is and Bill predict the word father, which is fine. That works with this very sentence. But if we give it Bill is John's, it's never seen Bill as the context to predict the right answer to this question. The answer here is, of course, son, which it's never actually predicted anyway from any of these tokens. So it's not entirely surprising that it's completely clueless in its ability to do this. So this is something that these models are very bad at. And to me, it's a really interesting pointer to a possible focal point for a lot of research that we could do as cognitive scientists to help make better language models and also to help understand better how our own minds work. So here's some clues. I don't know which order to present these 2 points in, but so let me actually present the second one first, because I think it's kind of interesting to see it that way. These language models do not show the reversal curse when reasoning with information, when they're reasoning with information that they're holding in their context. So here's an example. If we give the model the sentence in context, John is Bill's father, and then we say, just continuing the context, Bill is John's what? It's actually quite likely to say son. That's pretty smart, right? It's somehow learned to use this information in its context to allow it to make this inference where the words are in a particular, completely different order, and the word to be produced is a very different word than the one it's actually seen in its context. So this is something that we would ordinarily call an inference. And of course, it's something that we would expect a human to be able to answer this question too, right? I do want to see experiments done to sort of verify this and sort of document that humans are about equally good at this. And the study that we've done is pointing in that direction and has some relevant data, but more work is necessary along those lines. But intuitively, at least from the point of view of desideratum, we'd expect the model to be able to do. We would expect models to do this and humans to do it as well. And they can do it as long as the information is in their context. The problem is that if you clear the context state, so it's no longer in the set of things that are actively in what we might think of as its immediate working memory, it doesn't have that information at all. It only would have that if we had fine-tuned it into the weights, and in that case, it wouldn't have done a very good job, right? So, interestingly enough, amnesic patients like HM seem like language models in this respect. They don't exhibit deficits in their ability to understand and make simple inference from information in a current discourse context. Again, a study with amnesics would be useful in this regard to make this point clearly and give us a starting point of grounded data to base modeling work on, and that's something that I would like to see done. But the key thing is that the amnesic is like the language model as well, in that as soon as you distract the amnesic to another topic of conversation, and then you try to come back to something that you talked about 30 seconds before, or even if a person leaves the room after they've introduced themselves and told you about themselves, and then they come back in, the patient will act as though they've never even met the person before. The conversation doesn't exist. And so we have this special learning system in our medial temporal lobes that allows us to learn new things quickly. And this is something that I've worked on in the past. I think it's very relevant to all of these issues. This is a slide from a paper that I did about 10 years ago, updating a theory that we had initially done even about 20 years before that, introducing this idea that, when we learn new things, we learn them in a special part of our brain called the hippocampus, where we learn them in a form which we can bring back to mind for later use. And we don't learn them in a form which is directly encoded in the connection weights between the various parts of our brain that are involved in the more automatic and habitual aspects of language processing and visual representation and so on. So my suggestion here is that machines could solve the credit assignment problem by using complementary learning systems. Fine-tuning the information into their connection weights shows no transfer benefit for reversals, but when the new information is in the context window, then there's no reversal decrement. The models are using it as though they've understood it. They have a representation of it somehow that can constrain their further processing in the way that we would want. So the solution would be to somehow store this information that's in their context in an external memory, like we store the residue of previous conversations in our hippocampus, so that they can access it and bring it back into context for use at a later time. Here's the problem. It's very difficult to find this information in the context. So let me try to illustrate this briefly with this slide. Somehow or other, embedded in the patterns of activation inside the attention query keys and values of prior information in the context is the information that the model is using when it's getting the word John to predict that it should say Bill's son. And it's really interesting that it's able to do this because it must be using Bill is John's to set up the right query to find the right thing back here. And but it's all sort of diffusely spread around in these attention matrices and attention activations distributed widely throughout the model. So my proposal is to imagine that instead of having language models of the kind we have today, that we imagine that what we do when we understand language is that we process it and sort of chunk it up into sequences of thought-sized units. Thought-sized and thought-like in the sense that they are capturing the abstract relational content of the sentence and not the sequence of words per se, so that John is Bill's father and Bill is John's son are essentially represented as capturing the same relationship between two men, one of whom is the father and whom is the son, regardless of the order in which that is set. And that what we do when we process an individual sentence is we don't have access to all the previous words as such in the context of 12,000 previous tokens, but we have access instead to sort of condensed sentence level representations that have been constrained through the learning process to be useful in correctly anticipating the word sequences in subsequent sentences. This is something the models are already doing, but in a way that makes them unitized. And so things that we could imagine storing in a mechanism like a human hippocampus, or for an AI system in an external database, where they would be accessible representations of thought-like units in the native internal language of the mind. And that is the proposal that I am offering as a kind of a joint kind of model that's better at capturing our natural human-like abilities and also being a more potentially more performant model for AI. Just to briefly say how this addresses some of the issues I've raised, and I'm going to want to stop soon because I know I'm supposed to leave time for discussion. These sentence embeddings should encode the content of prior sentence in ways that are useful for predictions in subsequent sentence, capturing the capabilities of the in-context learning that we've already seen these models exhibit. And these embeddings should also be something that we could place in an external memory system so they can be accessed at inference time later, just as they would be if they'd remained in the context, or they would be if we had stored them in our hippocampus. And this contextualization will be facilitated because the representations of prior sentences would be accessible at all layers of the network processing subsequent sentences. That's a slightly technical point that I didn't go into in detail. We can come back to it in questions, but maybe I will end by just referencing a slightly different example to try to bring this point home. So I had this example earlier. I skipped over it in the interest of time, but maybe this helps give another sort of way of thinking about why I like this solution. So suppose you hear a sentence. John likes his coffee with cream and the last word in the sentence is honey. Well, you'll be surprised. Most people take their coffee with cream and sugar. And you could update the weights in your neocortical learning system by backpropagating error from there, making it so that each of these tokens is slightly more likely later to predict honey. But of course, if you fine-tune this into the system, it'll make it so that it'll tend to answer honey whenever anybody is queried here, not just John. And that doesn't seem right? What we want to do is sort of say, oh, hey, there's this special guy, John, who's the exception here. And what we would do is, instead of doing that in our system, we would store up this representation of John likes coffee with cream and honey. And so next time somebody refers to John liking coffee, we would query that representation and bring it back. And that would help us solve this credit assignment problem without producing a lot of interference with what we already know. Okay, there's a lot of extensions and future directions to this, but I'm sure I've said enough, and I did want to try to honor Ulrike's request that I give us almost 15 minutes for questions. So I'm going to stop there and see if any of you have questions.